Hello there and welcome to Simply About Earth, where curiosity meets comfort and science takes the scenic route to understanding. Tonight we're journeying somewhere very distant, not in space, but in time. 66 million years backward to a world that felt infinite, lush, and alive with creatures that would one day become the stuff of legends. The Cretaceous period, the last age of giants, the twilight of the dinosaurs. Before we drift back to that ancient landscape, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment and let me know your location. Is it late evening where you are? The kind of night that feels like it could stretch forever. Or maybe it's early morning and you're just easing into your day, curious about a world that ended long before ours began. Wherever you are, this is your moment to slow down, breathe, and let your imagination walk through forests that no human has ever seen. If you find this journey soothing, or even just a pleasant way to wind down, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of calm reach others who might need a little escape too. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let the world around you fade, because we're about to travel to a time when Earth was warmer, wilder, and far stranger than you might think. Imagine an afternoon somewhere on the Cretaceous Earth. The air is thick with moisture, heavy with the scent of plants you wouldn't recognize. Giant cycads rise like green towers, and flowering plants, the newcomers of evolution, spread across the undergrowth, their petals attracting insects that have only recently begun their intricate dance with pollen. The hum of wings fills the air. Dragonflies the size of small birds dart over shallow pools, and beetles glint like living gemstones beneath the sun. You can almost hear the distant bellow of something enormous moving through the forest, the slow, deliberate rhythm of footsteps that shake the ground. This was not the chaotic volcanic world of early dinosaurs. The Cretaceous was a world of refinement, of balance, a stage polished by millions of years of evolution. The continents, once clustered together in the supercontinent Pangaea, were drifting apart, shaping oceans and coastlines that would one day become familiar outlines on our modern maps. North America was split by a shallow inland sea. Europe was a cluster of islands. Australia was still attached to Antarctica, and India was speeding northward on its way to crash into Asia. The planet was in motion, not rushing, but endlessly rearranging itself. The climate was warm, almost tropical across much of the globe. There were no polar ice caps, only vast forests stretching toward the poles and shallow seas that sparkled under a thick, humid sky. It was a greenhouse world. Carbon dioxide levels were high, sea levels even higher. And yet, life flourished in extraordinary abundance. Plants grew thick and fast, feeding herbivores that in turn fed the predators that roamed the plains and forests. This was an Earth at its biological peak, rich, complex, alive with color and sound. In this world you might have seen herds of triceratops moving like armored tanks through fern fields, their frilled heads swaying as they grazed. You might have glimpsed a T-Rex standing motionless for a moment before lunging forward with terrifying speed, the culmination of over 100 million years of evolution in muscle and bone. Further south, long-necked titanosaurs, some stretching over 30 meters, moved with slow grace across floodplains, their necks arched like living bridges, their tails sweeping behind them in arcs of dust and sunlight. And yet it wasn't all giants. The Cretaceous belonged to the small and the nimble too. Mammals no larger than rabbits scurried in the shadows, laying the groundwork for what would one day come after. Birds, newly evolved from their dinosaur ancestors, flitted between branches, already testing the skies that would soon be theirs alone. The world was noisy in its own ancient way. Cicadas buzzed in forests that had never known human footsteps. The rumble of thunder rolled over coastal plains where storms brewed in the heat. Volcanoes far away exhaled occasional columns of ash, dusting everything with a reminder that Earth itself was still restless. But to the creatures of that time, this was normal. It was home. If you could stand quietly beneath a Cretaceous canopy, you might notice how different the light feels. The air, thick with humidity, scatters sunlight in a golden haze. Ferns sway gently in the breeze, and between their fronds you might catch the glint of an eye, a small dinosaur, feathered and alert, watching you from a distance. Its movements are quick, its gaze intelligent. These were not the sluggish reptiles that old movies once imagined. Dinosaurs were active, warm-blooded in many cases, their bodies finely tuned to their environments. Their world had rhythms as steady as any heartbeat. Rain fell in regular cycles, feeding rivers that wound lazily across continents. The oceans breathed with tides and currents that carried nutrients across thousands of miles. On land, ecosystems balanced delicately, predators and prey, plants and pollinators, forests and floodplains. Life had become a masterpiece of adaptation. It seemed unstoppable. Of course, the earth beneath it all was already whispering of change. The slow drift of continents altered ocean currents and air patterns. Volcanoes released carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere, sometimes warming the planet, sometimes cooling it. Tiny fluctuations that no creature could sense were adding up across the centuries. But for now, in this snapshot of time, everything looked eternal. There's something humbling about imagining this world, a planet both alien and familiar, the same blue oceans, the same gravity, the same sun tracing arcs through the sky, but everything else transformed. It's a reminder that Earth has worn many faces, each lasting only a moment in the scale of geological time. The Cretaceous just happened to be one of its most magnificent. The great predators would have ruled their territories with precision. A Tyrannosaurus might patrol its domain with the confidence of an apex hunter, its massive head swinging side to side as it scanned for movement. Every sound would matter: the crack of a branch, the rustle of foliage, the distant call of another dinosaur. For the herbivore's survival depended on vigilance. Triceratops would form groups not out of social comfort, but safety. Their horns weren't ornaments. They were insurance against the jaws of giants. And still, amid all this drama, there were moments of quiet, a nesting Myosaura tending her eggs, a dragonfly landing briefly on the surface of a pond, a breeze moving through the cycads. From space, if you could have looked down on Earth then, you'd see a planet glowing green and blue under swirling clouds. The land masses were smaller, fragmented, the oceans wider, but it would still look alive, more so than ever before. Photosynthesis, that invisible alchemy of sunlight and air, was painting the planet in endless shades of green. The Earth was breathing deeply. There's an odd comfort in realizing that this world existed completely without us. It thrived, changed, and disappeared long before we arrived. The dinosaurs didn't need observers, historians, or storytellers. They lived, and that was enough. Their existence wasn't a prelude to ours. It was its own complete story, one that lasted for millions of years and then ended in a single shattering moment. But that ending isn't here yet. Not in this moment. Right now, in the warmth of the late Cretaceous sun, the Earth feels eternal. There's no sign that anything is wrong, no hint of the shadow that's coming. For now, the dinosaurs rule unchallenged. They've weathered millions of years of evolution, adapted to new climates, new foods, new landscapes. They've seen continents drift, volcanoes rise, seas expand and recede. They've outlasted countless species before them. Why should anything change? The Cretaceous world, for all its scale and power, was also astonishingly delicate. Life didn't just survive, it performed, improvising across every possible landscape the planet could offer. Forests spread like green oceans, rivers braided through lands, and the air shimmered with the sound of wings and calls that have been gone for millions of years. If you could step quietly through a Cretaceous valley, you would see movement everywhere. A small herd of hadrosaurs wades across a flooded plain, their tails slicing the surface of the water like the keels of ships. They move with the confidence of creatures that have learned the seasons, the flood patterns, and the safest routes to feeding grounds. Nearby, a cluster of pterosaurs perches along limestone cliffs, their leathery wings folded like sails between gusts of wind. They are not the clumsy gliders you might imagine, but skilled navigators able to ride thermals with precision. The Cretaceous Earth was lush, and its abundance was owed to a quiet revolution happening among the plants. Flowering plants, angiosperms, had only recently arrived on the evolutionary stage, but their success was immediate and unstoppable. The emergence of flowers changed everything. Pollen and nectar invited insects to become collaborators, carrying the genetic material of one plant to another with an efficiency evolution had never seen before. In exchange, the insects gained nourishment. It was the beginning of a partnership that would reshape ecosystems and echo all the way to the present day. The dinosaurs, of course, are the headline act of this world. Their bodies dominate the landscape, but their survival depends entirely on the smaller players, the plants, the insects, the climate. Every roar, every chase, every nest, all of it ultimately powered by photosynthesis and pollination. The battles of this world were not only physical but ecological. Competition was constant. New species arose, pushing others aside. Climate zones shifted as continents drifted, creating fresh opportunities for some and crises for others. In North America, the western interior seaway split the land into two vast regions, each with its own evolving cast of species. Across these divided lands, evolution raced to fill every opening. Horns, frills, armor, and speed all became tools of survival, each generation adjusting slightly to the pressures of its environment. In the oceans, the story was no less dramatic. Warm, shallow seas covered much of the continents, filled with corals, ammonites, and marine reptiles. Giant mosasaurs hunted in these waters, sleek and muscular, apex predators of their realm. Their jaws could crush bone with a single bite, yet they shared the seas with delicate creatures, plankton, algae, and tiny shell builders that together sustained the entire food chain. To picture this world properly, it helps to think of scale. The Cretaceous wasn't simply a collection of giant animals, it was a planet operating on every level of life. Microbes in the soil fixed nitrogen for plants. Insects pollinated and decomposed. The air itself carried the breath of millions of species. It was thick with the scent of growth, decay, and renewal, a living atmosphere. Predation shaped everything. Every species was both hunter and hunted, and the balance between them was delicate. Tyrannosaurus rex was not simply a monster. It was an integral part of the ecosystem, keeping populations in check, removing the weak, and allowing plants to regenerate. But for all its grandeur, this was a fragile balance. The Cretaceous world operated under conditions that could not last forever. Volcanoes occasionally darkened the skies, reminding everything that the planet itself was alive and volatile. Yet somehow life adapted again and again. When a forest burned, new plants grew. When sea levels rose, new coastlines became nurseries for life. The world was always adjusting, always learning how to continue. If you're enjoying the journey so far, I'd be grateful if you took a moment to hit that like button. It helps more people find these quiet moments of wonder. The dinosaurs may be gone, but their world shaped the one we live in now. Every tree outside your window, every blade of grass, every bird's call traces its lineage back to this era of bloom and battle. Some of the creatures of this time were as remarkable for their ingenuity as for their size. The small raptor-like dinosaurs, for instance, displayed signs of complex behavior, pack hunting, nesting care, perhaps even communication beyond simple calls. Life was not mindless instinct. It was organized, adaptive, and surprisingly tender. Evolution was not just shaping bone and muscle, but behavior and intelligence. And the skies above were changing too. Feathers, which had begun as insulation or display, had become wings capable of sustained flight. The earliest birds were already gliding and flapping with skill, filling niches that would later belong entirely to their descendants. Every time one took off from a branch, it was a glimpse of the future, a world where dinosaurs would not be gone, only transformed. The seas of the Cretaceous were vast, warm, and restless. They spread across the continents in wide, shallow expanses that blurred the line between land and ocean. These waters were the silent architects of the age, shaping coastlines, feeding ecosystems, and nurturing some of the most extraordinary life forms the planet would ever know. If you could have floated upon those waters, you would have seen an ecosystem as rich as any coral reef today. Beneath the surface moved schools of fish in dazzling patterns, their scales catching the sunlight that filtered down in soft green-gold beams. Ammonites, spiral-shelled relatives of modern squid, drifted gracefully, their tentacles exploring the currents. Deeper still, in the open waters swam the true giants of the Cretaceous seas. Mosasaurs, the undisputed rulers of the marine world, glided through the depths with serpentine grace. They were reptiles, not fish, descended from land-dwelling ancestors who had returned to the water generations before. Some stretched over 15 meters, long enough to rival a modern whale. Among them swam plesiosaurs, their long necks moving like eels through the water, their paddle-like limbs beating rhythmically. Some species had necks so extended they seemed impossible, each vertebra part of an elegant and improbable design. Above them, in the open air, pterosaurs circled, scanning for movement beneath the waves. Some species like pteronan had wingspans over 7 meters and could travel vast distances across the seaway, diving occasionally to snatch fish near the surface. The Cretaceous oceans were not merely hunting grounds. They were nurseries of evolution. New species of fish appeared, their bodies adapting to every possible niche. And at the base of it all, invisible to the eye, was the quiet miracle of plankton, tiny drifting organisms that captured sunlight and transformed it into energy, feeding everything above them in the chain. Competition was constant, and the ocean's abundance came at a cost. Fossilized shells show bite marks, scars, and signs of healing, a record of lives lived on the edge. Some ammonites developed thicker shells, others changed their shape, evolving spines or patterns that helped them blend into the background. Adaptation was the rule, and the pressure never ceased. The coastal margins were especially dynamic. Mangrove-like forests and swamps lined the edges of the seaway, serving as nurseries for young marine life. Here, the distinction between land and water was blurred. Dinosaurs waded into tidal flats to feed, while fish and amphibians ventured inland with the tides. Every creature in this world lived within limits defined by the sea. Even the dinosaurs far inland depended on it. Indirectly, the oceans controlled the climate, the rainfall, the temperature of the air. They were the engine of Earth's stability. The ocean was not separate from the world above. It was its beating heart. Above the shimmering seas of the Cretaceous, another world unfolded. It was lighter, thinner, and filled with motion. The air itself was alive with wings, from tiny darting creatures that flitted between leaves to vast gliders that could cross entire coastlines without a single flap. The sky had become its own wilderness. Among the first to claim these heights were the pterosaurs, masters of flight long before any bird spread its wings. They had ruled the air for millions of years, adapting into dozens of forms, from small, agile hunters that darted over rivers to enormous species whose wings stretched wider than any creature before or since. Their bodies were built for flight. Imagine a coastline at dawn. The mist rises slowly over the water, and from the cliffs a group of pteranodon launches into the wind. Their wings catch the rising air currents and they glide effortlessly, barely moving. Below them, the ocean ripples with the movement of fish near the surface. Every tilt of a wing, every subtle shift in angle allows them to stay aloft with almost no effort. But the skies were beginning to change, because something new had entered them. Descendants of small feathered dinosaurs who had taken a different evolutionary path. The first true birds. In the Cretaceous, that experiment had reached its peak. The skies now belonged to two very different kinds of flyers. the leathery winged pterosaurs and the feathered birds that would eventually replace them. These birds were dinosaurs in every biological sense. They shared the same skeletal structures, the same patterns of muscle attachment, and even similar nesting behaviors. But evolution had given them something extraordinary, feathers capable of generating lift through flapping, not just gliding. This meant agility. Where pterosaurs soared long distances, birds could twist, turn, and hover. They could dart between trees and escape predators with maneuvers that the larger flyers could never match. The evolution of flight reshaped ecosystems in ways no single development had before. Flight allowed creatures to reach new habitats, escape ground-based predators, and find food in places that had once been inaccessible. Flight connected the sky to the ground in an endless exchange of energy and life. The coexistence of pterosaurs and birds is one of evolution's more elegant stories. They shared the same air but rarely the same roles. Pterosaurs ruled the open skies and coasts, while birds increasingly dominated forests and smaller habitats. Rather than direct competition, they seemed to partition the atmosphere, each group carving out its own kingdom in the wind. Not all that flew had feathers. The pterosaurs, though ancient, continued to thrive in parallel. In some regions they grew even larger. Quetzalcoatlus, one of the last and greatest of them, could reach heights comparable to a giraffe when standing on the ground. Its wingspan stretched over 10 meters. Yet despite its size it could fly, not through brute strength, but through mastery of air currents. The land beneath the Cretaceous skies was restless. It was not a silent foundation, but a living surface, moving, breaking, and rebuilding itself over millions of years. To the creatures walking across it, the ground may have seemed eternal, solid, dependable, but it was in constant motion. The continents were more humid than today. Rainfall was heavy, especially near the equator. Rivers swelled with the monsoons, overflowing their banks and creating fertile flood plains where herds of herbivores gathered to feed. These lands were rich with vegetation, cycads, ferns, palms, and flowering plants forming dense jungles that stretched for miles. When volcanoes erupted, ash fell across the landscape, burying forests and plains. At first it was destruction. The air darkened, the plants withered, the rivers filled with debris. But after the ash settled and mixed with the soil, it brought nutrients that renewed the land. Within a few years, new growth would cover the scars, richer than before. The earth's violence was part of its fertility. The soil of that world was alive in its own quiet way. Microbes and fungi decomposed organic matter, releasing nutrients back into the cycle. The roots of plants anchored themselves deep into the earth, binding layers of sediment and creating networks that stabilized ecosystems. Every death fed new life. Every fallen tree became the foundation for another. The rivers of the Cretaceous were wide and winding, carrying silt and nutrients through the continents. They carved valleys and left behind fertile floodplains that changed shape with every flood. When water receded, shallow pools formed, trapping fish and small creatures. Insects gathered there, followed by amphibians, reptiles, and birds. Fossil tracks found in these ancient riverbeds capture moments frozen in time: the crossing of a herd, the chase of a predator, the struggle of an animal trapped in mud. Each set of footprints is a record of movement, a silent photograph pressed into stone. The shape of the continents influenced not just where animals lived, but how they evolved. As land masses drifted apart, populations became isolated. Species that had once mingled were now separated by oceans or mountains. Over generations they diverged, adapting to their new environments until they became entirely new forms of life. To the dinosaurs, the earth beneath them was both ally and adversary. It provided food, shelter, and safety, but it could also shift without warning. Life depended on the stability of forces that were never truly stable, yet somehow balance always returned. The land destroyed and rebuilt itself in an endless cycle. The world above the restless earth was green, not the kind of green we see today. soft and scattered across cultivated landscapes, but a deep, overwhelming green that seemed to breathe with the planet itself. Forests covered nearly every continent, spreading over mountains, valleys, and swamps, wrapping the land in an endless web of leaves, stems, and roots. If you could walk through a Cretaceous forest, your first impression would be of size. Trees towered above, their trunks thick and rough, their crowns vanishing into a canopy, so dense that the sunlight filtered down in shifting beams. The air would be heavy with humidity, thick with the scent of sap and decaying leaves. Every breath you took would be filled with the sharp green scent of vegetation. It was a world that grew without pause, a landscape that never slept. The plants of that time were both familiar and alien. Conifers still dominated many regions, their needle-like leaves adapted to the warmth and moisture of the Cretaceous climate. But they were beginning to share space with a new arrival: flowering plants. These angiosperms had appeared millions of years earlier, but during this period they spread across the globe, transforming ecosystems from the ground up. The arrival of flowers changed not just how plants reproduced, but how animals lived. Pollination was one of the quiet revolutions of Earth's history. Before flowers, most plants relied on the wind to carry pollen, an inefficient process that wasted vast amounts of energy. But flowers found a better way. They offered rewards, nectar, scent, and color, to attract insects and other animals. The forests themselves were layered worlds. The canopy was ruled by the trees, conifers, cycads, magnolias, and the first hardwoods. Beneath that layer, smaller trees and shrubs filled the gaps, their leaves reaching for whatever sunlight filtered through. The forest floor was a dense mat of ferns, mosses, and low-lying plants, damp and full of life. Amid this living architecture, animals moved constantly. Herds of herbivorous dinosaurs wandered through the trees, their massive bodies parting branches and crushing ferns underfoot. They fed slowly, stripping leaves with mouths adapted to every possible shape of vegetation. Every feeding motion reshaped the forest, pruning it, spreading seeds through droppings and opening sunlight patches where new plants could grow. Smaller creatures thrived in the spaces the giants left behind. Lizards and mammals darted between roots, searching for insects and fallen fruit. Insects themselves filled every corner, crawling, flying, burrowing. The forest was not a single community, but a collection of countless micro-worlds, each sustained by the constant exchange of energy between sunlight, plant, and animal. The climate helped sustain this abundance. The Cretaceous atmosphere held more carbon dioxide than today's, which meant that photosynthesis was particularly efficient. Plants grew faster, larger, and in greater numbers. The oxygen levels were high, feeding the metabolism of animals and allowing insects to grow to sizes that would seem impossible now. Yet the green world was not always gentle. The same density that supported life also hid danger. Predators moved through the trees silently, using shadow and foliage for cover. Even in the heart of this abundance, survival was never guaranteed. Every leaf and shadow carried both food and threat. For the herbivores, the forest was a constant negotiation. They had to eat almost continuously to sustain their size, but every mouthful carried risk. Some plants evolved chemical defenses, toxins, bitter tastes, or tough fibers to discourage grazing. In response, dinosaurs developed stronger teeth and complex digestive tracts capable of breaking down resistant material. The insects were the unsung engineers of this world. Pollinators, decomposers, scavengers, they worked continuously to maintain the system. Without them, the flowering plants would have failed to spread. The dinosaurs may have ruled visibly, but the green world answered to smaller masters. The dinosaurs lived within this system, not above it. Their lives depended entirely on the reliability of plant growth. When drought struck, populations fell. When volcanic ash enriched the soil, they flourished. The stability of the green world determined everything. It provided food, shelter, and air. It was the invisible foundation of their age. Without the forests, there would have been no herds, no migration, no predators. Every roar, every call, every movement of muscle and bone began with sunlight striking a leaf. The green world was the silent engine behind the spectacle of life. The forests of the Cretaceous stretched endlessly, alive with color and movement, but above the canopy, across the plains and along the wide floodplains, there was a presence that commanded all attention: the giants. They were the largest creatures ever to walk the earth, vast bodies of muscle and bone that moved with a weight and grace that defied imagination. If you could stand at the edge of a late Cretaceous plain, you might first hear them before you saw them. The sound was not a roar or a stomp, but a deep vibration, the low, rhythmic thud of enormous feet pressing into the ground. The air would tremble slightly, carrying the sound of heavy breathing and the soft swish of tails sweeping through tall ferns. Then, emerging through the haze, you would see them, long-necked titanosaurs moving in slow procession, their heads rising and falling above the vegetation like ships at sea. These sauropods were the ultimate expression of the dinosaur body plan. Their necks stretched for meters, their bodies massive but balanced, their legs thick and columnar like tree trunks. The largest among them weighed as much as 70 tons, and yet their skeletons were masterpieces of engineering, lightened by air pockets within the bone, allowing them to move with surprising efficiency. Around them, smaller herbivores moved with quicker, sharper rhythms. Hadrosaurs grazed in herds, their duck-billed snouts sweeping through the low vegetation. They were social creatures, communicating through deep calls that carried across long distances. Their young stayed close to their sides, protected within the massive bodies that moved like a living wall. Further north, herds of triceratops wandered the floodplains. Their frilled heads and horns made them unmistakable, and their behavior likely mirrored that of modern herd animals. They were powerful but cautious, their senses tuned to the approach of predators. The horns were not just weapons but tools of communication, displays of dominance, recognition, or even affection. Predators watched from the edges of this abundance. The most famous among them, Tyrannosaurus rex, was both feared and misunderstood. It was massive, yes, but not reckless. Its body was built for bursts of speed, not endurance. Its sense of smell was among the most acute of any animal in history, capable of detecting prey from miles away. Its bite was strong enough to crush bone, yet its behavior was not that of a mindless killer. It was an opportunist, a strategist. To see a Tyrannosaurus in motion would have been to witness a perfect combination of power and control. The muscles of its legs coiled and released with precision. Its tail counterbalanced every movement. Its head swung side to side as it advanced, eyes locked on motion. There was no wasted effort. Every step was an act of intention. The Age of Titans was not defined by violence, though it contained plenty of it. It was defined by scale. Everything in the Cretaceous seemed larger: the animals, the trees, even the insects. Evolution had found a rhythm that favored size. In warm climates with high oxygen levels and abundant food, bodies could grow immense without strain. But the size came with consequences. The great herbivores needed constant access to food and water. Their migrations shaped the landscape as surely as rivers did. When they moved, they trampled paths that became seasonal corridors, used again and again for generations. The giants were not separate from the ecosystem. They were part of its metabolism. At night, the landscape changed. The heat of the day faded, replaced by the steady chorus of insects. The larger animals rested, their silhouettes faintly visible against the moonlit sky. Steam rose from the ground where their warm bodies had lain. The world of giants did not sleep completely. It only slowed. In the southern continents, the diversity of these titans was extraordinary. South America in particular was home to some of the largest creatures that ever lived. Argentinosaurus, Patagotitan and Dreadnoughtus moved through ancient floodplains like living mountains. Their fossils show that they traveled in groups, perhaps for protection, perhaps simply because the land could only sustain them if they moved together, feeding and moving on in cycles. The nests of large herbivores were massive, shallow depressions lined with vegetation, often clustered together in nesting grounds that stretched for kilometers. Fossilized eggs and embryos show that some species cared for their young after hatching, bringing food and guarding them from predators. The bond between parent and offspring, once thought to be rare in prehistoric life, was already a defining behavior. The climate sustained this abundance, but it was beginning to change. The hidden pulse of the planet, the volcanic activity deep beneath the crust, had been steadily altering the composition of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated, causing subtle shifts in temperature and rainfall. Slowly, ecosystems adjusted. The dinosaurs moved with them, following the food, following the water, unaware that the balance was tilting. At their peak, the diversity of dinosaurs was staggering. There were armored forms with plates and spikes, agile runners built for speed, giants that grazed the canopy, and tiny scavengers that darted through the undergrowth. Each was perfectly adapted to its environment. Evolution had refined the design of the dinosaur over 160 million years, optimizing it for almost every conceivable niche. The Age of Titans was not only a biological era, but a geological and atmospheric balance that made such creatures possible. The high oxygen content supported their metabolism. The warm, stable temperatures allowed them to breed and grow year-round. The plentiful vegetation sustained their endless hunger. Every aspect of the environment aligned to create a world capable of supporting life on an unprecedented scale. Yet within that perfection lay vulnerability. The same interconnectedness that made the world so rich also made it fragile. The Titans, for all their power, were bound to the balance that sustained them. They could not adapt quickly to a world that shifted too fast. Still, in their time, they were the unchallenged rulers of Earth. They shaped the planet simply by existing, their footprints pressed deep into the mud, leaving impressions that would harden into fossils, preserved through the ages. They were part of the planet's circulation, the living manifestation of its strength. The Age of Titans was not a moment of chaos or domination. It was a period of balance, the culmination of millions of years of evolution. The planet had created its masterpiece, vast, breathing ecosystems powered by sunlight, fueled by growth, held together by the invisible rhythm of the Earth. It was a world at its most alive. And still, beneath it all, the ground continued to move. The pulse of the planet never stopped. Far beyond the clouds, something small and distant moved through the dark of space, unnoticed, insignificant against the stars. The Titans went on feeding, breathing, living, unaware that their world, for all its strength, was not built to last forever. The Cretaceous world had been thriving for millions of years. The forests were dense, the seas were full, the air was rich and warm, the great creatures of land, sky and water had settled into a long equilibrium, unaware that anything could ever disturb it. Every day began the same way, sunlight spreading across misted valleys, insects lifting into the air, herds stirring in the early heat. To them this world must have seemed eternal. But time, even then, was counting down. If you could have stood in that time, nothing would have looked wrong. The earth was alive in every direction. Trees stretched into humid air, volcanoes smoldered faintly on distant horizons. Animals moved through their daily cycles, feeding, nesting, migrating, all according to patterns that had worked for millions of generations. The earth did not warn them. There was no sound of a ticking clock, no sign of approaching disaster. The ending began, like all endings do, invisibly. Beneath that calm surface, however, changes were gathering. Subtle, slow, but steady. The planet's internal pulse had grown louder. Volcanic fields in regions like what would one day become India had entered an active phase, releasing enormous volumes of gas into the atmosphere. For thousands of years, the Deccan Traps poured lava across the land, creating plateaus hundreds of meters thick. Each eruption filled the air with carbon dioxide and sulfur, altering the balance of the atmosphere. At first, the changes were minor, a few degrees warmer here, a little less rainfall there, but across millions of years, those small shifts added up. The climate of the late Cretaceous began to waver. Some regions grew drier. The lushness that had defined the earlier Cretaceous started to thin, not everywhere, not dramatically, but gradually. Still, life adapted. For the dinosaurs, these fluctuations were a challenge, but not a catastrophe. They had weathered such changes before. When food became scarce in one region, herds moved to another. Life continued to flow along the lines carved by instinct and adaptation. But the environment was becoming more volatile. As the planet's inner fires burned, gases built up in the air and water. The oceans absorbed much of the carbon dioxide, becoming slightly more acidic. Tiny marine organisms that formed the base of the food chain, the plankton and shell builders, began to show stress. The balance shifted subtly, unpredictably. The Earth was quietly rearranging itself. On the surface, everything still looked normal. A late Cretaceous morning would have been bright and full of sound. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. Birds, true descendants of the dinosaurs themselves, called from branches and darted through sunlight. Herds of triceratops grazed along the riverbanks, their horns gleaming with dew. A mother Tyrannosaurus led her young through tall grass, their eyes alert for movement. The world was alive, completely unaware that it stood on the edge of history's most violent boundary. In these final millennia, the diversity of life was astonishing. More species existed on Earth than at almost any point before. The planet was at its ecological peak, and that is often how endings arrive, not with decline, but with abundance. The richer the system, the more complex the web, the more fragile it becomes when disturbed. The dinosaurs were thriving, but some patterns hinted at unease. Fossil evidence from this period shows fluctuations in population sizes. Certain herbivores became less common in some areas, while others grew more dominant. Sea levels fluctuated, drowning some habitats and revealing others. Evolution continued to react to an environment that was no longer predictable. But evolution requires time, and time was running out. Far above this living world, beyond the clouds, beyond the blue haze of atmosphere, a small object had been traveling for a long time. It was ancient, a fragment of rock and metal left over from the formation of the solar system, orbiting silently between worlds. For millions of years it had wandered the outer reaches of space, until something sent it on a new course, a line through the dark that intersected perfectly with Earth. No creature on the planet could have seen it coming. The air was clear, the seas calm, the forests peaceful, but in the high reaches of the atmosphere, invisible to all living eyes, that ancient rock was already beginning to glow. Still, on the surface, life went on. The last generations of dinosaurs lived as their ancestors had for millions of years. Herds migrated across open plains. Raptors hunted in coordinated bursts. In the oceans, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs patrolled the depths, unaware that their realm too was part of what would soon change. Nothing in the behavior of the planet suggested an ending. If anything, the world seemed more alive than ever. The final day of the Cretaceous began like any other. The air was warm, the sun bright in what would one day be called the Yucatan Peninsula. Tropical forests stretched toward a shallow sea. The morning light filtered through the canopy, painting the forest floor in golden shadow. Animals moved through the trees, hunting, feeding, calling. The ground was soft from recent rain. There was no reason to notice anything unusual. The planet seemed entirely at peace. A few hours later, a streak appeared in the sky. To any creature that looked up, it would have seemed strange but brief. A bright line across the heavens, moving faster than sound. Birds scattered from the trees. Some animals looked up, confused by the flash of light that lasted only seconds. And then the world changed forever. The asteroid entered the atmosphere at nearly 70,000 kilometers per hour. The air in front of it compressed violently, heating to temperatures that turned the object into a white-hot sun. It exploded through the sky, leaving behind a column of fire that stretched from space to the surface. In its final seconds, it struck the Earth with the energy of billions of atomic bombs. The point of impact was a shallow sea in what would one day be the Yucatan Peninsula. The explosion released energy equivalent to 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. The asteroid itself was obliterated instantly, its mass converted into heat and shock. The ground at the impact site vaporized. Rock melted and flowed like liquid. The air turned to fire. The pressure wave expanded outward faster than sound, tearing through the atmosphere in all directions. The forests ignited instantly. Trees vaporized into flame. Animals caught in the open disintegrated where they stood. The shock continued through the ground, triggering earthquakes across continents. Mountains quivered. Rivers changed direction. The entire planet shook as if the core itself had been struck. Above, the sky was a furnace. The impact had thrown trillions of tons of molten rock and vapor into space. For a moment, the planet was surrounded by a halo of glowing debris, a ring of incandescent dust that encircled the Earth. Much of it fell back within hours, re-entering the atmosphere as a rain of fire. From pole to pole, the air glowed red-orange, and the surface of the planet was bathed in infrared heat, strong enough to ignite forests across continents. Even those far from the blast felt the heat. Temperatures at ground level rose suddenly, not from sunlight, but from the atmosphere itself. Plants curled and blackened. Animals fled in confusion, seeking shade where there was none to be found. The fires spread rapidly, merging into vast infernos that consumed everything from coast to mountain. Smoke rose in colossal plumes, joining the dust and vapor already filling the air. Within hours, the sky that had been bright blue turned dark and turbulent. The creatures of the ocean suffered as well. The initial blast boiled the water near the impact site. Everything within hundreds of kilometers was cooked instantly. Further out, the waves churned the seas, stirring up sediments and driving oxygen from the water. Marine life that had survived the heat soon faced suffocation. The air, once filled with the sounds of insects and birds, fell silent. The fires burned through forests that had stood for centuries. The planet's great carbon stores, the trees, the soil, the vegetation, released their gases in one vast exhalation. The sky, now thick with soot and ash, began to block the sun. Within days, the light faded. At first it was a dimming, the sun shrouded as if by thick clouds. Then over weeks the light weakened further. The atmosphere, loaded with dust, sulfur and carbon, became nearly opaque. Day and night merged into a perpetual twilight. Temperatures fell rapidly. This was the beginning of the long darkness, an impact winter that would last for years. In that darkness the survivors clung to what warmth they could find. Small mammals stayed in burrows, their metabolism slowed, feeding on stored food or scavenging what they could. Some birds sought shelter in hollows and caves, waiting for light to return. Crocodiles and turtles, protected by their ability to live in cold water and go long periods without food, endured in silence. Life, reduced to embers, waited for the fire to pass. Photosynthesis stopped. The green world went silent. Animals that depended on plants for food starved first. Herbivorous dinosaurs, so vast and powerful in life, could not find enough to eat. Their massive bodies, built for abundance, were too large for scarcity. One by one, the herds weakened. Predators, deprived of prey, followed. The ecosystems that had thrived for millions of years collapsed in a matter of weeks. The smaller creatures fared better. Mammals, birds, insects and reptiles that could hide, burrow or go dormant stood a chance. Their size became their advantage. They needed less, could survive longer, could eat what others could not. In the darkness, the rules of survival changed. The titans that had ruled the land were no longer suited to the world that remained. The impact dust took years to settle. Each day, less sunlight reached the surface. Each night, the cold deepened. Snow fell even in tropical regions. The air grew still, heavy with dust and ash. The once loud world became quiet. The forests, stripped of leaves and branches, stood like blackened skeletons. The great rivers slowed, choked with debris. Everything that had thrived in the warmth of the Cretaceous now faced a silence that stretched beyond comprehension. In that silence, the survivors waited. Some creatures, like small mammals, fed on roots, insects, or anything they could find. Birds that could eat seeds endured the darkness longer than those that fed on insects. Life's persistence was not dramatic. It was quiet, cautious, almost invisible. Months passed, then years. The dust in the atmosphere slowly began to settle. Sunlight, faint and filtered, returned in thin beams. The fires were gone, replaced by frost. The earth was no longer warm and humid. It was pale and dry. The great age of dinosaurs was over, but the planet itself remained. When sunlight finally returned fully, it was weak at first. The atmosphere had been permanently changed. The forests did not regrow evenly. Some areas recovered, others stayed barren, but wherever life had managed to survive, in burrows, in the deep sea, in seeds, it began to emerge again. The first green shoots appeared on the ashen ground, small and fragile but alive. The extinction that followed the impact wiped out about 3/4 of all species on Earth. Almost every large animal vanished. The dinosaurs that had ruled the land, the great reptiles of the seas, the flying pterosaurs, all gone. The world that emerged after was smaller, emptier, but open to new possibilities. The visitor from the void had not intended destruction. It was a simple consequence of motion, of physics, of chance. After striking the earth, most of it vaporized, becoming part of the air and water it destroyed. The rest sank into the molten rock beneath the crater. Its journey ended, but the story it triggered continued for millions of years. In the grand scale of time, the impact was brief. Seconds of violence that reshaped the planet for eons. The age of Titans ended in fire and darkness, and from that darkness, the future began. When the light finally returned to the Earth, it revealed a world unrecognizable from the one that had come before. The long night had stripped the planet bare, leaving behind a canvas of ash and stone. The forests were gone, the seas were quieter, and the air was thinner and cooler. What life remained moved slowly, cautiously, as though testing the edges of survival itself. The giants had vanished, their bones buried in the new soil forming from layers of dust and time. What remained were the survivors, the small, the quiet, the unnoticed. They were not the rulers of this new world, not yet. They were its remnants, its inheritors by chance and resilience. The first signs of recovery were faint, almost invisible. Ferns spread quickly across the land, their spores carried by wind into every open space. They grew in thick mats over the ash, their roots stabilizing the fragile soil. Their return gave the planet a new shade of green, duller, lower to the ground, but alive. Insects returned soon after, feeding on decay and new vegetation. Beetles, ants, and flies adapted easily to the cooler air and the new plants. With them came spiders and other small predators, rebuilding the lower layers of the food chain. The animals that had survived the impact came out cautiously. They were creatures of the edges, burrowers, scavengers, opportunists. The world they emerged into was one of silence and opportunity. With the great predators gone, no single species dominated. Each pocket of life grew according to what the environment would allow. And in that openness, evolution found new directions to explore. Mammals were among the most successful survivors. Before the impact, they had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs, small, nocturnal creatures that fed mostly on insects, seeds, or eggs. They had learned how to hide, how to adapt quickly, how to survive with little. These were the traits that saved them. In a world of scarcity, they could live on almost anything. Most of these early mammals were small, no larger than rats or rabbits. They lived in burrows or crevices, venturing out only when necessary. Some species fed on insects, others on plants or carrion. This flexibility was crucial. In a world that changed so drastically from year to year, specialization was dangerous. Versatility meant survival. Birds, too, endured. The ones that survived were not the large gliding species of the open skies, but smaller ground-dwelling or seed-eating forms. Their ability to fly gave them mobility, allowing them to seek food and shelter across wide areas. These birds were the bridge between two ages, the last link to the world of the dinosaurs and the first voices of the new era. Reptiles survived as well, though fewer in number. Crocodiles and turtles, creatures of endurance and patience, weathered the crisis with little change. Their slow metabolisms allowed them to survive long periods without food. When warmth returned, they emerged to bask in the pale sunlight, unchanged, while the world around them had transformed. Insects flourished again quickly, as they always have. Their small size, rapid reproduction, and adaptability made them nearly immune to extinction. They became the engineers of recovery, decomposing the dead, pollinating the new plants, and providing food for everything that followed. The Earth itself was still changing. The tectonic plates continued their steady drift. Volcanic activity remained high for a time, releasing gases that warmed the atmosphere and ended the impact winter. As the air cleared and the planet heated, the climate stabilized into something new. On land, evolution accelerated. The ecosystems were empty enough for experimentation. Mammals diversified rapidly. Some remained small and insectivorous. Others grew larger, exploring new diets and behaviors. Within a few million years, there were herbivores that grazed on ferns and early flowering plants, and predators that hunted them. The age of the dinosaurs had ended, but the age of mammals had begun. The new forests were different from the ones that had fallen. Flowering plants now dominated, spreading quickly through seeds carried by wind, water, and animals. They produced fruit to attract dispersers, a partnership that would define much of future evolution. Where the Cretaceous forests had been ruled by size, these new forests were ruled by complexity. As the plants returned, the air changed once more. Carbon dioxide levels, elevated by the fires and volcanic activity, began to decline as vegetation captured it again. Oxygen levels rose slowly. The atmosphere cleared, becoming thinner and cooler. The sunlight, now filtered through less haze, was sharper and brighter. It illuminated a planet covered not in giants, but in intricate webs of small life. The survivors of the shadow did not emerge unscarred. Each lineage bore the marks of the catastrophe. The mammals carried the instinct to burrow, to hide, to store, to survive through uncertainty. The birds retained the caution of their ancestors, the quickness to flee, the awareness of sudden change. Even the plants evolved resilience. Seeds that could wait through years of darkness, roots that could withstand drought or flood. In time, balance returned. Forests spread across continents. Rivers and lakes stabilized. The oceans teemed again with life. The planet, once dark and empty, became vibrant and green. But it was not the same world. The ecosystems were new, the rules rewritten. The age of reptiles was over. The age of mammals had begun in earnest. From this quiet rebirth would come the ancestors of all the creatures that would later populate the Earth: primates, whales, elephants, horses, and eventually, the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene was not just a line in stone, it was a transformation in the fabric of life itself. The survivors had inherited a planet both wounded and fertile. The catastrophe that had nearly erased them had also cleared the path for everything that would come after. In the slow passage of millions of years, the traces of the disaster faded. The crater filled with sediment. The ash turned to soil. The bones of the dinosaurs became fossils buried deep beneath layers of rock. But the descendants of the survivors carried their legacy forward, reshaping the Earth once more in new ways. The resilience that had saved them became the driving force of evolution. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Cretaceous was quieter, but it was not empty. It was different in rhythm. smaller in scale, and more intricate in its design. The age of giants had ended, yet their presence had not vanished. It lingered in the air, in the soil, in the DNA of the living things that followed. The echoes of those giants continued, woven into the biology of every creature that walked or flew or swam in the new world. The dinosaurs were gone, but their influence was not. The birds that filled the Paleogene skies were not merely descendants of dinosaurs. They were dinosaurs, transformed by time. Their bones still carried the same hollow architecture that once lightened the bodies of flying predators. When they spread their wings against the sunlight, they were continuing a story that had begun long before the extinction. On the ground, mammals filled the spaces left by the fallen titans. Yet even they bore traces of what had come before. Evolution does not erase, it repurposes. The flexibility that defined mammals, their ability to live in varied environments, to regulate temperature, to nurture their young, had been sculpted in part by the pressures left behind by the age of dinosaurs. The bones of the giants buried beneath the soil began to turn to stone. Layer after layer of sediment covered them, silt, sand, ash, pressing the memory of that age into permanence. Over millions of years these remains became fossils, silent records of lives that had once shaped the planet. Each fossil was a fragment of the Earth's memory, a line in the long story of time. The echoes of the giants were not only physical, they existed in the rhythms of the planet itself. The carbon and calcium of their bones became part of the rocks and oceans, feeding new chemical cycles. The forests that grew over their remains drew nutrients from their decomposing bodies, turning death into soil, and soil into growth. Every living thing that rose afterward was, in a literal sense, built from the remains of what came before. As time passed, new giants appeared, though none quite like those that had come before. Some mammals grew massive, the ancestors of elephants, whales, and ground sloths. They filled ecological spaces that had been empty since the extinction. But the world that allowed them to exist was different. The age of planetary-scale gigantism was over. The Earth had entered an age of moderation. Yet the memory of scale persisted in nature's imagination. The whales, descending from small land mammals, returned to the sea and grew larger than even the greatest dinosaurs. The elephants filled the land with their slow, deliberate movements, shaping vegetation and soil in ways reminiscent of the sauropods. The pattern had changed, but the echo remained. When humans eventually appeared millions of years later, they too were shaped by those same forces. The structure of their bones, the organization of their lungs, the balance of their hormones, all inherited from lineages that had survived the long night after the Cretaceous. Humanity's rise was not separate from the dinosaurs' fall. It was one more echo in the same vast continuum. And when people began to dig into the ground, unearthing the fossilized bones of creatures they could scarcely imagine, the echoes became voices again. The stone skeletons spoke of a time when the world was ruled by beings so immense and strange that they seemed impossible. Their discovery connected two distant ages, the present and the ancient past, through curiosity and wonder. Museums filled with their remains. Names were given: Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Brachiosaurus, Ankylosaurus. Their images appeared in art, in books, in the minds of children who could not yet comprehend timescales, but understood awe. The echoes had traveled through stone and memory, becoming part of human culture. The Earth, of course, continued without pause. It did not know that one of its later species would remember the dinosaurs, reconstruct their lives, and find in them a reflection of itself. The planet kept turning. Seasons came and went. Species appeared and vanished. The same slow, indifferent processes that had once ended the dinosaurs now shaped everything that followed. But in the minds of those who studied the past, the echoes grew louder. The fossils were not just stones, they were reminders of continuity. In every feather that lifts on the wind, there is a trace of that ancient world. In every bird song at dawn, there is the faintest resonance of the Cretaceous forests. The warm blood of mammals carries within it the same biological ingenuity that once powered the bodies of the great reptiles. The ecosystems that surround us, the forests, the plains, the oceans, are all built upon foundations laid by those giants. Their extinction was not an ending but a transformation. Their legacy was not silence but complexity. Every movement of life since then has been a continuation of their world in miniature, a world still guided by the same forces, still pulsing with the same energy, still carrying the same persistence that allowed life to survive the worst of nights. The echoes of giants remain everywhere, in the rocks beneath our feet, in the air we breathe, in the lineage of every creature that moves today. They remind us that time does not erase, it reshapes. The world that was theirs became ours, not through conquest but through inheritance. And somewhere deep below the forests and mountains, beneath layers of stone and fossil, the bones of the giants still rest. Their weight is part of the planet now, their stories locked within its geology, their echoes carried forward in the pulse of everything still alive. The world turns beneath the same stars that once watched the giants walk. The continents, shaped and reshaped by time, still carry their traces. The air that fills your lungs now once passed through the leaves of the Cretaceous forests. The calcium in your bones was born in the same oceans where the ammonites once floated. Every breath, every heartbeat, every sound of wind through trees is part of the same unbroken chain that began long before any eyes looked toward the sky and wondered. The earth has seen endless beginnings and endings. It has burned, frozen, fractured, and healed. It has been covered in forests and ice, ruled by reptiles and birds, mammals and insects. And through it all, the same pulse has never stopped, the quiet rhythm that carries life forward, even through catastrophe. The story of the dinosaurs is only one verse in a song that has been playing for 4.5 billion years. Somewhere tonight, far from cities and light, the air still carries the same weight it did in the time of the giants. The night sky arches overhead, filled with ancient light, the glow of stars that outlived everything that ever walked this world. If you close your eyes and breathe slowly, you can almost feel it, the long memory of the planet, the deep continuity that runs through rock and air and living things alike. It isn't about extinction or even survival. It's about persistence, the quiet endurance of life in all its fragile and stubborn forms. The knowledge that even after the fire, after the dark, after the silence, something always returns, something small, something unseen, something patient. The fern that grows in ash, the bird that sings after winter, the world never ends completely. It changes, waits, and begins again. The giants are gone, but their echoes remain all around you. In every leaf that unfurls, in every drop of water that falls back to the sea, in the hum of insects, in the shadows that move across the ground, in the warmth that rises with morning light, their world became ours. Their time became our time. The same sunlight that once touched their scales now touches your skin. The same gravity that carried their steps now carries yours. So when you breathe, you are breathing with them. When you sleep, you're resting in the same long cycle they once did, under the same stars, on the same ground, within the same unfolding story. The dinosaurs may have vanished from sight, but the planet that shaped them still turns slowly, steadily, endlessly. And as you listen now, the earth is still moving beneath you. The air is still shifting, quiet and patient. Somewhere in the dark, the sea is still breathing against the shore. Somewhere deep inside the planet, heat still flows from its core. Everything that was continues in different forms, in different rhythms. Nothing has truly disappeared. You can close your eyes now and let it all fade. The ancient forests, the seas, the shadows of titans walking through sunlight millions of years ago. Let the sound of their world dissolve into the quiet of this one. The earth has seen so much, and yet tonight it is still here, turning as it always has, carrying everything it has ever been. Breathe with it. Slow, steady, the same rhythm as the planet beneath you. The same pulse that began before time had a name, and will go on long after. The giants are gone. The world remains. And in its silence they are still here, not as fossils, not as memory, but as part of everything that is. If you find yourself drawn into this continuation, I'd be grateful if you took a moment to like the video, and perhaps subscribe if you haven't already. These quiet journeys through time seem to resonate with people who need a moment of wonder and perspective, and your support helps us reach others who might need that same gentle escape. But for now, settle in once more. Let the present fade away, because we're about to witness something remarkable. Not the sudden drama of destruction, but the patient miracle of renewal. We're going to watch a planet heal. The Earth that greeted the first full sunrise after the long darkness was transformed beyond recognition. Where vast forests had once stretched to every horizon, now lay a landscape of ash and stone. The air was thinner, cooler, sharp with the scent of dust and decay. Rivers ran black with soot. The seas reflected a pale sky through water that had grown strange and acidic. It was a world emptied of its familiar voices, a planet holding its breath. Yet even in that silence, something stirred, in burrows beneath the ash, in crevices between rocks, in the deep soil where seeds had waited through the endless night. Life persisted, not the grand, towering life of the Cretaceous, but something smaller, quieter, more patient. The survivors of the Great Dying were about to inherit the Earth. The first to emerge were the ferns. They had always been pioneers, quick to colonize disturbed ground, and the ash-covered wasteland was disturbed ground on a planetary scale. Their spores, tiny, lightweight, carried by every breeze, found purchase in the nutrient-rich ash. Within months, the first green appeared, not the deep emerald of the lost forests, but a pale, tentative green that spoke of new beginnings. If you could have walked across this recovering landscape in those early years, you would have found yourself in a world that looked almost alien. The familiar landmarks were gone, the towering trees, the lush undergrowth, the teeming diversity of life. Instead, there was a carpet of ash stretching to the horizon, broken only by the stubborn green of ferns pushing through the grey. The silence would have been profound. No bird songs, no insect hum, no rustle of large animals moving through vegetation, just the whisper of wind across empty plains and the occasional crack of cooling volcanic rock. It was a world waiting, holding its breath for what would come next. The fern spikes, as paleontologists would later call them, left their mark in the fossil record. Layers upon layers of fern spores, more concentrated than at any other time in Earth's history, telling the story of a world where almost nothing else could grow. For perhaps 1,000 years, these simple plants dominated the recovering landscape, preparing the soil, stabilizing the ground, slowly building the foundation upon which more complex life could return. But the ferns did not work alone. Fungi, those quiet decomposers that had always worked in the shadows, became the unsung heroes of the recovery. They spread through the ash like an invisible network, breaking down the organic matter left by the fires, recycling nutrients, creating the chemical conditions that would allow other plants to grow. In many ways, the fungi were the first architects of the new world, patient, methodical, essential. These fungal networks were more sophisticated than anything that had existed before. The trauma of the extinction had created vast amounts of dead organic matter, and the fungi evolved new strategies for breaking it down. They formed extensive underground webs that connected different patches of recovering vegetation, sharing nutrients and information across vast distances. Some scientists believe these early fungal networks were the ancestors of the complex mycorrhizal associations that help forests communicate today. As the ferns spread and the fungi worked, other survivors began to venture from their hiding places. Insects emerged first: beetles, ants, flies, their small size and rapid reproduction making them perfectly suited to this empty world. They fed on the decay, pollinated the early plants, and began to rebuild the intricate web of relationships that connects all living things. The beetles were particularly important during this early phase of recovery. Their larvae were perfectly adapted to feeding on rotting wood and organic matter, helping to break down the massive amounts of debris left by the global fires. Different species specialized in different types of decay. Some preferred freshly burned wood, others worked on material that had been decomposing for months or years. Together they formed a complex recycling system that gradually converted the remains of the old world into the nutrients needed by the new. The ants, meanwhile, began their long journey toward the sophisticated social organizations that would eventually make them one of the most successful groups on Earth. In the early Paleogene, most ant species were relatively simple, but they were already experimenting with division of labor and cooperative behavior. Some species began cultivating fungi in underground gardens, creating the first agricultural systems in the post-extinction world. The flies played their own crucial role as pollinators and decomposers. Many flowering plants that survived the extinction had depended on more specialized pollinators that had gone extinct. The flies stepped into this role, their generalist feeding habits making them perfect interim pollinators while more specialized relationships evolved. The insects brought with them something the devastated world desperately needed: movement. The static landscape of ash and stone began to stir with tiny wings, crawling bodies, the endless motion of creatures going about the business of survival. Sound returned to the world, not the grand chorus of the Cretaceous, but a quieter symphony of buzzing, clicking, rustling, life learning to make noise again. Slowly, cautiously, larger creatures followed. Small mammals emerged from their burrows, blinking in the unfamiliar light. These were not the tiny, mouse-like creatures that had scurried in the shadows of the dinosaurs. The great dying had changed the rules, and in a world without giants, there was suddenly room to grow. The early mammals that emerged were already beginning to diversify. Some species had survived by becoming even smaller and more efficient, developing the ability to enter torpor during the coldest periods of the impact winter. Others had survived by being generalists, able to eat anything they could find: seeds, insects, carrion, even fungi. This flexibility would prove to be one of the most important traits in the recovering world. The mammalian survivors showed remarkable behavioral innovations. Many species had developed enhanced parental care during the crisis, with parents investing more time and energy in fewer offspring. This strategy helped ensure that young mammals had the best possible chance of survival in the harsh post-extinction environment. Some species also began showing the first signs of extended social cooperation, with individuals sharing food and shelter during the hardest times. These early mammals also developed enhanced sensory abilities. In a world where familiar food sources had disappeared, the ability to detect new resources became crucial. Many species evolved more sensitive hearing, allowing them to locate insects moving beneath the ash. Others developed enhanced chemical senses, enabling them to find edible fungi or detect the earliest signs of plant recovery. The early mammals of the Paleogene were experimenters. Evolution, freed from the constraints of the old world, began to test new forms, new strategies, new ways of being alive. Some mammals remained small, but grew more specialized, developing keener senses, more efficient metabolisms, more complex social behaviors. Others began to grow larger, filling the ecological niches left empty by the vanished dinosaurs. One of the most significant early experiments was the evolution of arboreality. With the destruction of the forest canopy, many mammals that had lived on the ground began exploring life in the trees. The survivors included several lineages that would eventually give rise to primates, and their early adaptations for climbing, grasping hands, flexible joints, enhanced depth perception, were refined during this period of experimentation. It was during this time that the first recognizable ancestors of modern mammal groups appeared. The early ungulates, ancestors of horses, cattle, and deer, began their long evolutionary journey. These early forms were small, generalized creatures that looked nothing like their modern descendants. They had simple teeth suitable for eating a variety of foods, relatively short legs, and spreading toes that helped them navigate the soft, ash-covered ground. The first carnivores evolved from small, generalized hunters into more specialized predators. Initially, these were opportunistic feeders that hunted insects, small mammals, and scavenged carrion. But as prey species began to diversify and increase in size, the carnivores responded by developing more sophisticated hunting strategies and more specialized anatomy. The ancestors of primates appeared in the trees of the recovering forests, their forward-facing eyes and grasping hands perfectly suited for life in an arboreal environment. These early primates were small, nocturnal creatures that fed primarily on insects and early fruits. Their large eyes adapted for night vision, and their enhanced manual dexterity were key innovations that would eventually lead to the evolution of advanced intelligence. But perhaps most remarkably, some mammals began to experiment with an idea that would have seemed impossible in the Cretaceous. They began to return to the sea. The ancestors of whales started as small four-legged creatures living along coastlines, hunting fish in shallow water. The extinction had emptied many marine niches, creating opportunities for land animals to explore aquatic lifestyles. These early aquatic mammals were initially much like otters, spending part of their time on land and part in the water, but over millions of years, some lineages would abandon the land entirely, evolving into the ocean's new giants. Their transformation from land mammals to fully aquatic creatures represents one of the most remarkable evolutionary transitions in the fossil record. The evolution of whale ancestors involved numerous anatomical changes. Their limbs gradually became more paddle-like, their bodies became more streamlined, and their senses adapted to underwater life. Perhaps most remarkably, they evolved the ability to hold their breath for extended periods and to navigate using sound, innovations that would eventually lead to the sophisticated echolocation systems of modern toothed whales. The birds, too, were changing. As the only surviving dinosaurs, they carried within their hollow bones and feathered bodies the genetic memory of their mighty ancestors. But the post-extinction world favored different strategies. Flight, which had been an advantage in the Cretaceous, became essential in a world where resources were scattered and unpredictable. The early Paleogene saw an explosion of bird diversity. Some grew flightless and large, briefly becoming the new terrestrial giants before mammals claimed that role. Gastornis, a massive flightless bird that stood over 2 meters tall, dominated some early Paleogene ecosystems. These giant birds filled the predator niche, left vacant by the extinction of large theropod dinosaurs, hunting small mammals and other ground-dwelling creatures. Other bird lineages perfected their aerial abilities, developing the sophisticated flight patterns and migration behaviors that would allow them to colonize every corner of the recovering world. The evolution of long-distance flight was particularly important, as it allowed birds to track seasonal resources across vast distances and to colonize new habitats as they became available. Many modern bird groups trace their origins to the early Paleogene radiation. The ancestors of modern raptors, waterbirds, and songbirds all appear in the fossil record during this period. Each group developed specialized adaptations for particular lifestyles. Hawks and eagles evolved enhanced vision and powerful talons for hunting. Waterfowl developed waterproof feathers and webbed feet for aquatic life. And the early songbirds began experimenting with the complex vocalizations that would eventually become birdsong. The evolution of birdsong during the Paleogene was particularly significant. In the silence that followed the extinction, the ability to communicate over long distances became crucial for finding mates and coordinating social behaviors. Early songbirds developed increasingly sophisticated vocal abilities, leading to the complex songs and calls that characterize many modern species. The skies once shared between birds and pterosaurs now belonged entirely to the descendants of dinosaurs. This created new opportunities for aerial evolution. Birds began to explore flight strategies that had been impossible when pterosaurs dominated the air. Some evolved soaring abilities that allowed them to travel vast distances with minimal energy expenditure. Others developed hovering flight that enabled them to exploit nectar resources as they became available. And what of the reptiles? The great archosaurs, The group that included dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodiles had been devastated by the extinction, but not all were lost. Crocodiles, with their slow metabolisms and ability to survive in water, emerged from the darkness largely unchanged. Their conservative body plan, which had served them well for over 200 million years, proved equally suitable for the post-extinction world. In fact, crocodiles briefly experimented with terrestrial gigantism during the early Paleogene. Some species grew to enormous size and lived entirely on land, becoming apex predators in early mammalian ecosystems. These terrestrial crocodiles had long legs and were probably capable of running down prey, filling the niche that had been occupied by large theropod dinosaurs. Snakes and lizards, many of which had been small enough to shelter in burrows or crevices during the impact winter, began to diversify rapidly in the New World. The reduction in mammalian diversity created opportunities for reptilian predators, and many snake and lizard lineages evolved larger body sizes and more specialized hunting strategies during the early Paleogene. The evolution of venomous snakes was particularly significant during this period. Venom allowed relatively small predators to kill much larger prey, providing an effective hunting strategy in a world where traditional reptilian predators, the large dinosaurs, were gone. The first venomous snakes appear in the fossil record during the Paleogene, and they quickly diversified into the many families we see today. Turtles, those ancient wanderers, continued their patient journey through time. They had survived previous extinctions, and they would survive this one too. Their shells, their longevity, their ability to slow their metabolism when necessary, all of these traits served them well in a world where survival often meant simply outlasting the hard times. Turtles also began to diversify into new ecological niches during the Paleogene. Some lineages became fully terrestrial, developing high-domed shells and powerful limbs for digging. Others became more aquatic, evolving streamlined shells and paddle-like limbs. The sea turtles, in particular, underwent a major radiation during the Paleogene, evolving into the large oceanic forms that would dominate marine turtle faunas for the rest of the Cenozoic. The recovering world was not uniform. Different regions recovered at different rates, depending on local conditions, climate, and the particular mix of survivors in each area. Some areas remained barren for thousands of years, while others burst into life almost immediately. The planet was becoming a patchwork of experiments, evolution trying different approaches in different places, seeing what worked and what didn't. In the northern continents, recovery was generally faster than in the south. The impact had occurred in what is now Mexico, and the effects had been most severe in North and South America. These continents had experienced more intense heating from the fireball, more severe tsunamis, and heavier deposits of impact debris. As a result, recovery took longer in the Americas than in other parts of the world. Europe and Asia, being farther from the impact site, retained more of their surviving fauna and flora. This gave them a head start in the recovery process, and many early Paleogene evolutionary innovations first appeared in these regions before spreading to other continents. The geographical pattern of recovery provides important insights into how life responds to global catastrophes. If you're finding this story of recovery as fascinating as I am, a like would mean so much. It helps other people discover these moments of wonder hidden in our planet's deep past. In North America, the recovering landscape was dominated by vast wetlands and early forests. The climate was still warm, warmer than today, but not as consistently hot as it had been in the Cretaceous. Seasonal variation began to appear for the first time in millions of years, creating new challenges and opportunities for life. The wetlands were particularly important during the early recovery. These environments provided stable conditions where many species could survive and diversify. Wetlands also served as corridors for migration, allowing species to spread across the continent as climate and vegetation patterns changed. Many early mammalian lineages first appear in wetland deposits, suggesting that these environments were crucial nurseries for post-extinction evolution. The plants responded to the changing conditions by becoming more sophisticated. The flowering plants, which had been relative newcomers in the Cretaceous, now began to dominate. They developed more efficient root systems, more varied leaf shapes, more complex relationships with their pollinators. The coevolution between flowering plants and their animal partners accelerated during the Paleogene, leading to some of the most intricate ecological relationships in nature. Trees began to grow in distinct layers: canopy, understory, shrub layer, ground cover, creating the vertical complexity that would characterize forests for the rest of Earth's history. This stratification created numerous microhabitats, each with its own particular conditions of light, temperature, and humidity. The three-dimensional complexity of recovering forests allowed many more species to coexist than had been possible in the simpler ecosystems of the immediate post-extinction period. But the most important change was happening underground. The soil, once a simple mixture of rock particles and organic matter, was becoming a complex ecosystem in its own right. Bacteria, fungi, insects, and worms worked together to create the rich, living foundation that would support all terrestrial life. The development of complex soil ecosystems was crucial for the long-term recovery of terrestrial life. Soil organisms recycle nutrients, improve soil structure, and create the chemical conditions necessary for plant growth. Without healthy soil ecosystems, the recovery of complex plant communities would have been impossible. This new soil fertility had profound effects on plant evolution. Trees could grow taller, their roots reaching deeper, their crowns spreading wider. The interaction between plants and soil created feedback loops that accelerated recovery. The more life that grew, the richer the soil became, which supported even more life. Grasses began to appear for the first time during the Paleogene, though they would not become dominant until later. These humble plants would eventually reshape entire continents, but their early evolution was slow and gradual. The first grasses were small, forest-dwelling plants that looked very different from the vast grasslands that would eventually cover much of the world. The evolution of grasses was closely tied to changes in global climate. As the world began to cool and become more seasonal, environments became drier and more variable. Grasses, with their ability to survive grazing, fire, and drought, were perfectly adapted to these new conditions. Their deep root systems also helped prevent soil erosion, making them valuable in areas where forests had been cleared by natural disturbances. The oceans, too, were healing, but marine recovery followed a different timeline than terrestrial recovery. The acid that had dissolved so many shells was gradually neutralized by erosion from the land, but this process took hundreds of thousands of years. New species of plankton evolved, adapted to the changed chemistry of the seawater, but marine ecosystems remained relatively simple for much of the early Paleogene. The recovery of marine ecosystems was complicated by the fact that the extinction had disrupted the entire oceanic food web. The loss of large marine reptiles had eliminated many top predators, while the extinction of many plankton species had damaged the base of the food web. Recovery required the re-evolution of complex food webs from the surviving species. Fish populations were among the first to rebound. Fish are generally more resilient to environmental change than many other groups, and their ability to move between different habitats helped them survive the extinction and colonize new environments during the recovery. Many modern fish families first appear in the Paleogene fossil record, suggesting that this was a period of major diversification for marine vertebrates. But the most dramatic changes were happening in the deep ocean, around volcanic vents on the seafloor. Entire ecosystems had survived the extinction almost untouched. These oases of life became the seeds from which marine recovery spread. Bacteria that could derive energy from chemicals rather than sunlight formed the base of food webs that stretched up through the water column and eventually reached the surface. The hydrothermal vent ecosystems that flourished during the Paleogene were remarkably complex. Giant tube worms, clams, and other invertebrates formed dense colonies around the vents, supported by bacteria that converted chemicals in the hot water into usable energy. These ecosystems were completely independent of sunlight, making them immune to the effects of the impact winter. As surface ocean conditions improved, Many vent species spread beyond their original habitats. This dispersal helped seed the recovery of shallow marine ecosystems, providing genetic diversity and ecological complexity that might otherwise have taken millions of years to evolve from scratch. The early Paleogene oceans were strange and wonderful. Giant sharks prowled waters that teemed with new forms of life. Early whales, still recognizably mammalian, with fur and external ears, began their long transformation into creatures of the deep. The seas were becoming wild again, but with a different cast of characters than they had known before. The evolution of filter-feeding whales during the Paleogene represents one of the most remarkable transitions in evolutionary history. These early whales developed the ability to strain huge quantities of small organisms from the water, converting the ocean's microscopic productivity into large, warm-blooded mammals. This innovation allowed whales to grow to enormous sizes while feeding at the base of the food web. The development of echolocation in toothed whales was equally remarkable. This biological sonar system allowed whales and dolphins to navigate and hunt in the dark depths of the ocean. The sophistication of marine mammal echolocation rivals any technology humans have developed. It allows these animals to create detailed three-dimensional maps of their environment using nothing but sound. Seabirds, too, began to specialize for marine life during the Paleogene. Different species evolved different feeding strategies. Some became surface plungers, diving from great heights to catch fish. Others became pursuit divers, chasing prey underwater using their wings for propulsion. Still others became surface feeders, skimming the water for small fish and plankton. The evolution of these diverse marine ecosystems created complex food webs that connected all parts of the ocean. Nutrients cycled from the deep ocean to the surface, supporting phytoplankton that fed small fish, which in turn fed larger fish, marine mammals, and seabirds. The ocean had become a fully integrated system once again. On land, the absence of large dinosaurs created opportunities that mammals were quick to exploit. The early Paleogene saw the evolution of the first true giants among the mammals. Uintatherium, a massive herbivore with an elaborate skull decorated with horns and tusks, wandered the forests of North America. These early giants were impressive animals, some reaching the size of modern rhinoceros, but they were still much smaller than the largest dinosaurs had been. Coryphodon, another early giant, grew to the size of a small car and developed semi-aquatic habits, perhaps filling the niche once occupied by large dinosaurs in coastal environments. Its broad, flat feet and barrel-shaped body suggest that it spent much of its time in swamps and shallow water, feeding on aquatic vegetation. But these early mammalian giants were experiments, evolution testing the limits of what was possible in the New World. Most would eventually go extinct, replaced by more successful lineages. The path from the small generalized mammals of the early Paleogene to the diverse megafauna of later epochs was not straight. It was full of dead ends, false starts, and remarkable innovations. The experimental nature of early Paleogene mammalian evolution is evident in the bizarre forms that appeared during this period. Pantodonta included some of the strangest mammals ever to live, with massive bodies, small brains, and peculiar teeth that suggest diets unlike anything seen in modern mammals. These animals represent evolutionary experiments that ultimately failed, but they demonstrate the remarkable creativity of evolution during periods of ecological opportunity. The primates, our own distant ancestors, began their story during this time. The earliest primates were small, nocturnal creatures that lived in the trees of the recovering forests. They had large eyes for seeing in the dark, grasping hands for navigating through branches, and brains that were large relative to their body size. These early primates, known as plesiadapiforms, were quite different from modern primates. They lacked many of the features we associate with primates today: forward-facing eyes, opposable thumbs, complex social behaviors. But they represented the first steps toward the remarkable cognitive abilities that would eventually characterize the primate lineage. The evolution of primate characteristics was closely tied to life in the trees. Forward-facing eyes evolved to provide the depth perception necessary for judging distances while leaping between branches. Grasping hands developed to provide secure grips on thin branches and twigs. Enhanced brain function was needed to process the complex three-dimensional environment of the forest canopy. Early primates were not yet the intelligent social creatures that would eventually give rise to humans, but they carried within their genes the potential for everything that would follow. Their large brains, complex behaviors, and sophisticated sensory systems laid the foundation for the remarkable cognitive evolution that would characterize later primate evolution. The Paleogene climate was generally warm and humid, much like the Cretaceous had been, but with important differences. The absence of polar ice caps meant that sea levels remained high, but the distribution of land and water had changed as the continents continued their slow drift. India was still racing northward toward its collision with Asia. Australia was beginning to separate from Antarctica. The Atlantic Ocean was widening, and new mountain ranges were forming as tectonic plates ground against each other. These geological changes had profound effects on global climate and ocean circulation. The breakup of Gondwana, the southern supercontinent, created new ocean basins and altered the flow of ocean currents. The formation of new mountain ranges changed wind patterns and precipitation distribution. The world was still warm, but it was beginning to develop the regional variations in climate that would become more pronounced as the epoch progressed. The separation of Antarctica from Australia was particularly significant. This allowed the formation of the circumpolar current, a massive ocean current that flows around Antarctica, isolating it from warmer waters. This change would eventually lead to the formation of the Antarctic ice sheet, marking the beginning of the long-term cooling trend that would characterize the later Cenozoic. The plants responded to these changes by diversifying rapidly. Tropical rainforests established themselves in equatorial regions, their incredible diversity of species creating some of the most complex ecosystems the planet had ever seen. These rainforests were characterized by extremely high species diversity, complex vertical structure, and intricate relationships between plants and animals. Temperate forests spread across mid-latitudes, dominated by deciduous trees that could shed their leaves during cooler periods. The evolution of deciduous habit was an important innovation that allowed trees to survive in seasonal climates. By dropping their leaves during unfavorable seasons, deciduous trees could reduce water loss and energy expenditure while waiting for more favorable conditions. Even the polar regions, while still warm by today's standards, began to develop their own distinctive plant communities. The fossil forests found in polar regions during the Paleogene contain a mix of tropical and temperate species, reflecting the unusual climate conditions of the time. These polar forests had to cope with months of continuous darkness during winter, but they remained warm enough to support diverse plant communities. This diversification of plant life created new opportunities for animals. Different forest types supported different communities of insects, which in turn supported different birds, mammals, and reptiles. The world was becoming more varied, more complex, more richly textured than it had been in the immediate aftermath of the extinction. The diversification of flowering plants during the Paleogene was particularly spectacular. New families of flowering plants appeared at a rapid rate, each experimenting with different strategies for reproduction, dispersal, and survival. The coevolution between flowering plants and their animal partners, pollinators, seed dispersers, herbivores, created some of the most intricate ecological relationships in nature. The evolution of fruits during the Paleogene was especially important for mammalian evolution. Fruits provided a high-energy food source that was particularly valuable for animals with large, energy-hungry brains. Many early primates were frugivorous, and the availability of fruits in tropical forests may have been crucial for the evolution of primate intelligence. But perhaps the most important plant innovation of the Paleogene was the continued evolution of grasses. These humble plants, which first appeared in the early Paleogene, would eventually reshape entire continents. Grasses are incredibly tough and resilient. They can survive grazing, fire, drought, and flood. They form dense root systems that bind soil together and create some of the richest growing medium on Earth. The spread of grasslands during the later Paleogene created entirely new ecosystems. Animals evolved to take advantage of this new resource. Early horses developed longer legs for running across open plains. Their teeth became adapted for grinding the tough grass. The ancestors of cattle, antelopes, and bison began their own evolutionary journeys in these early grasslands. The grasslands also changed the relationship between predator and prey. In the dense forests of the Cretaceous, hunting had often been a matter of stealth and ambush, but in the open grasslands, speed and endurance became more important. This led to an evolutionary arms race. Prey animals became faster and more alert, while predators became more efficient hunters. The evolution of cursorial adaptations, features that enhance running ability, was a major theme of later Paleogene mammalian evolution. Many mammalian lineages developed longer legs, more efficient gaits, and enhanced cardiovascular systems during this period. These adaptations were driven by the expansion of grasslands and the new ecological opportunities they provided. The early Paleogene was also a time of remarkable innovations in animal behavior. The absence of large dinosaurs created ecological niches that required new strategies to exploit. Some mammals began to live in social groups, cooperating to find food and protect their young. Others developed migration patterns following seasonal resources across vast distances. Social behavior evolved independently in many mammalian lineages during the Paleogene. The benefits of group living, enhanced predator detection, cooperative foraging, shared parental care, outweighed the costs in many environments. This led to the evolution of complex social systems that would eventually give rise to some of the most sophisticated animal societies on Earth. The evolution of communication systems was closely tied to the development of social behavior. Animals living in groups needed ways to coordinate their activities, warn of danger, and maintain social bonds. Many mammalian lineages developed increasingly sophisticated vocalizations during the Paleogene, laying the foundation for the complex communication systems seen in modern species. Flight evolved independently several times during this period. Bats appeared, becoming the only mammals to achieve powered flight. Their echolocation abilities allowed them to hunt in complete darkness, exploiting a niche that no other mammal could fill. The evolution of bat echolocation was independent of whale echolocation, demonstrating the power of convergent evolution to produce similar solutions to similar problems. Meanwhile, birds were perfecting their own aerial abilities, developing the complex wing structures and flight patterns that would make them masters of the sky. The diversification of bird flight styles during the Paleogene was remarkable. Different species evolved for soaring, diving, hovering, and high-speed pursuit. The Paleogene oceans were witnessing their own revolution. The extinction had eliminated most large marine reptiles, creating opportunities for new kinds of ocean giants. Early whales, still transitional forms with characteristics of both land and sea mammals, began to grow larger and more specialized. The transition from land to sea in early whales involved numerous anatomical changes. Their limbs gradually became more paddle-like, their bodies became more streamlined, and their senses adapted to underwater life. The evolution of the whale skull was particularly remarkable, with the nostrils gradually moving from the tip of the snout to the top of the head, eventually forming the blowhole characteristic of modern whales. Some early whales developed filter feeding abilities, straining small organisms from the water. This innovation allowed them to exploit the vast productivity of the open ocean, feeding directly on plankton and small fish. The evolution of baleen, the filtering apparatus used by modern filter-feeding whales, represents one of the most remarkable feeding adaptations in vertebrate evolution. Others became active hunters, pursuing fish and squid through the open ocean. These early toothed whales developed increasingly sophisticated hunting strategies, including the evolution of echolocation. The ability to navigate and hunt using sound allowed whales to exploit the three-dimensional environment of the ocean in ways that no previous marine vertebrates had managed. Sharks, which had survived the extinction relatively unscathed, began to diversify rapidly. The early Paleogene saw the evolution of some of the largest sharks in Earth's history, including the ancestors of the massive megalodon that would terrorize later oceans. These apex predators helped to structure marine ecosystems, controlling populations of fish and marine mammals. The diversification of shark-feeding strategies during the Paleogene was remarkable. Some species became filter feeders like the whales, others evolved massive jaws capable of crushing the shells of large mollusks. Still others became fast, open-ocean hunters that could pursue prey for long distances. Each feeding strategy required different anatomical adaptations, leading to an explosion of shark diversity. The recovery of coral reefs was one of the most visually spectacular aspects of Paleogene marine life. The extinction had devastated reef ecosystems, but corals are remarkably resilient. New species evolved that were adapted to the changed ocean chemistry, and within a few million years, vast reef systems were flourishing again in tropical waters. These reefs became centers of marine diversity, supporting countless species of fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and other marine life. The complex three-dimensional structure of coral reefs creates numerous ecological niches, allowing many different species to coexist in a relatively small area. The recovery of reef ecosystems was a sign that the oceans were truly healing. The Paleogene reefs were different from their Cretaceous predecessors. New coral families evolved that were better adapted to the changed ocean conditions. The relationships between corals and their symbiotic algae became more sophisticated, allowing for more efficient energy transfer and greater growth rates. The fish communities that inhabited these reefs also evolved new forms and behaviors, creating some of the most diverse marine ecosystems in Earth's history. But the Paleogene recovery was not without its setbacks. The early part of the epoch was marked by several smaller extinction events and climate fluctuations. Volcanic activity remained high in many parts of the world, occasionally releasing enough gas and ash to disrupt regional ecosystems. Ocean temperatures fluctuated, causing some marine species to go extinct and creating opportunities for others. These minor crises were important because they continued the process of evolutionary experimentation that had begun immediately after the Great Extinction. Species that might have survived in a stable environment were eliminated, while more adaptable forms thrived. The result was a continuous process of innovation and adaptation that shaped the trajectory of life throughout the epoch. One of the most significant of these smaller events was the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a period of extreme global warming that occurred about 56 million years ago. Massive releases of carbon into the atmosphere, possibly from volcanic activity or the destabilization of methane deposits, caused global temperatures to spike dramatically. The thermal maximum was triggered by the release of enormous quantities of carbon into the atmosphere over a relatively short period, probably less than 20,000 years. This carbon may have come from volcanic activity associated with the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean, or from the sudden release of methane hydrates from ocean sediments. Whatever the source, the result was a rapid and dramatic warming of global climate. Global temperatures rose by 5-8 degrees Celsius during the thermal maximum, transforming ecosystems around the world. Arctic regions became subtropical, with palm trees growing as far north as Alaska and northern Canada. Ocean temperatures rose so much that many deep-sea organisms went extinct, while tropical species spread into formerly temperate regions. This thermal maximum had profound effects on life. Many mammal lineages went extinct, while others underwent rapid evolution to cope with the changed conditions. The extinction rate among mammals was particularly high in North America, where many early Paleogene lineages disappeared entirely. However, the thermal maximum also created new evolutionary opportunities. Tropical forests spread much further toward the poles than they ever had before. Dense rainforests extended into regions that are now temperate or even Arctic, creating vast new habitats for tropical species. Many mammalian lineages expanded their ranges dramatically during this period, spreading into regions that had previously been too cold for them. Ocean circulation patterns changed dramatically during the thermal maximum, affecting marine ecosystems around the world. The warming disrupted the normal patterns of deep water formation, reducing oxygen levels in many parts of the ocean. This led to widespread extinction among deep-sea organisms, but also created new opportunities for surface-dwelling species. But the thermal maximum also created new opportunities. The extreme warming opened up new habitats in polar regions, allowing life to colonize areas that had been too cold before. Many of the mammal groups that would dominate later epochs, including the ancestors of modern horses, primates, and carnivores, underwent major evolutionary radiations during or immediately after this period of extreme warming. The horse lineage in particular shows dramatic changes during the thermal maximum. Early horses were small, forest-dwelling animals with multiple toes on each foot. During the warming event, they began to diversify rapidly, with some lineages becoming larger and developing longer legs. These changes foreshadowed the later evolution of horses as grassland animals. Primate evolution was also accelerated by the thermal maximum. The warming climate allowed tropical forests to expand dramatically, creating vast new habitats for arboreal mammals. Many modern primate groups first appear in the fossil record during or shortly after the thermal maximum, suggesting that this period of environmental change was crucial for primate diversification. The carnivores also underwent major changes during this period. The thermal maximum saw the first appearance of true carnivores, mammals with specialized teeth and digestive systems for eating meat. These early carnivores were still relatively small and generalized, but they represented the beginning of a lineage that would eventually produce some of the most sophisticated predators in Earth's history. The recovery from the thermal maximum showed how resilient life had become. The ecosystems that had been built up during the early Paleogene proved capable of surviving even dramatic climate change. Species migrated, adapted, and evolved new strategies for survival. The planet's biosphere had learned to bend without breaking. The cooling that followed the thermal maximum was gradual but significant. As carbon was gradually removed from the atmosphere through weathering and biological processes, global temperatures slowly returned to more normal levels. This cooling created new evolutionary pressures favoring species that could adapt to more seasonal and variable climates. Many of the mammalian lineages that had expanded during the thermal maximum had to adapt to the cooling conditions that followed. Some species went extinct, but others evolved new adaptations that would serve them well in the changing world. The period following the thermal maximum was characterized by continued evolutionary innovation and adaptation. As the Paleogene progressed, the world began to look more and more familiar. Forests developed the complex, multi-layered structure that characterizes modern woodlands. Grasslands spread across vast areas, supporting herds of grazing animals and their predators. Mountains rose and were worn down by erosion, creating new landscapes and habitats. The mammals, in particular, began to resemble their modern descendants. The first true carnivores evolved sophisticated hunting strategies and social behaviors. Herbivores developed complex digestive systems that allowed them to extract maximum nutrition from plant material. Early primates became more social and intelligent, laying the groundwork for the remarkable cognitive abilities that would eventually characterize their lineage. The evolution of mammalian digestive systems during the Paleogene was particularly remarkable. As plant communities became more diverse and complex, mammalian herbivores evolved increasingly sophisticated ways of extracting nutrition from plant material. Some species developed multi-chambered stomachs that allowed for more efficient digestion of cellulose. Others evolved specialized gut bacteria that could break down tough plant fibers. The evolution of rumination, the process of chewing cud, was a particularly important innovation. This allowed herbivores to extract maximum nutrition from low-quality plant material, enabling them to survive in environments where food was scarce or of poor quality. The evolution of rumination was closely tied to the spread of grasslands, as grasses are particularly tough and difficult to digest. Carnivore evolution during the Paleogene was equally impressive. The early carnivores were relatively small and generalized, but they gradually evolved more specialized hunting strategies and anatomical adaptations. Some became pursuit predators, developing long legs and efficient cardiovascular systems for chasing prey across open ground. Others became ambush predators, evolving powerful muscles and sharp claws for killing prey quickly. The evolution of pack hunting was a particularly significant innovation. By working together, carnivores could bring down prey much larger than any individual could handle. This required the evolution of complex social behaviors and communication systems, laying the foundation for the sophisticated social carnivores we see today. But perhaps most importantly, the Paleogene established the patterns of recovery and adaptation that would characterize life for the rest of Earth's history. The planet had learned that life could survive even the most catastrophic events, that from destruction could come innovation, from extinction could come opportunity. The world that emerged from the Paleogene was not the same as the one that had been lost in the Great Dying. It was smaller in scale, more complex in structure, more dynamic in its responses to change. The age of giants was over, but the age of diversity had begun. By the end of the Paleogene, about 23 million years ago, the foundations of the modern world were in place. Mammals dominated terrestrial ecosystems, birds ruled the skies, and new forms of marine life populated the oceans. The climate was beginning to cool, setting the stage for the ice ages that would come later. Grasses had spread across vast areas, creating the savannas and prairies that would support some of the most spectacular animal communities in Earth's history. But the story was far from over. The mammals that had inherited the Earth would continue to evolve and diversify. Some would grow to rival the dinosaurs in size, others would develop intelligence and social complexity beyond anything the planet had seen before. The humble survivors of the Great Extinction would give rise to elephants and whales, to eagles and tigers, to monkeys and apes, and eventually to a species that would look back through deep time and wonder at the story of its own origins. The cooling climate that characterized the end of the Paleogene would continue into the following epoch, the Neogene. This cooling would be driven by several factors: the continued drift of continents, changes in ocean circulation, and the gradual removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by weathering and biological processes. The formation of the Himalayas, as India collided with Asia, was particularly important for global climate. These massive mountains altered global wind patterns and increased weathering rates, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and contributing to global cooling. The uplift of the Tibetan Plateau also affected the monsoon systems that bring rain to much of Asia. The opening of the Drake Passage between South America and Antarctica allowed the formation of the circumpolar current, which isolated Antarctica from warmer ocean waters. This led to the formation of the Antarctic ice sheet, the first permanent ice on Earth in millions of years. The formation of ice sheets would become a major factor in global climate for the rest of Earth's history. As grasslands expanded and forests retreated, many mammalian lineages adapted to more open environments. Horses developed longer legs and more efficient gaits for running across open plains. Their teeth became higher crowned and more complex for grinding tough grasses. Similar adaptations evolved in many other grassland herbivores. The evolution of grassland carnivores was equally dramatic. Large cats evolved for hunting in open environments, developing powerful hind legs for leaping onto prey and strong jaws for delivering killing bites. Dogs evolved pack hunting strategies for pursuing prey across long distances. Hyenas developed bone-crushing teeth for scavenging in environments where carcasses were valuable resources. The Paleogene recovery reminds us that life is both fragile and resilient. It can be devastated by catastrophe, reduced to a few scattered survivors hiding in the ruins of a broken world. But given time, given space, given opportunity, it can rebuild, innovate, and create wonders beyond imagination. The mammals that inherited the post-extinction world faced challenges that no previous group of animals had ever encountered. They were living in a world that was simultaneously empty and full of potential, empty of the familiar players that had dominated ecosystems for over 160 million years, but full of resources and opportunities for those creative enough to exploit them. The story of the Paleogen is ultimately a story of innovation and adaptation. It shows how life responds to catastrophe, not just by surviving, but by exploring new possibilities, testing new strategies, creating new forms of beauty and complexity. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Cretaceous was not just a pale imitation of what had come before, it was something entirely new, something that carried within it the seeds of all future evolution. The Paleogen established the foundation for the modern world. The flowering plants that came to dominate terrestrial ecosystems, the mammals that filled every available niche, the birds that mastered the skies, the marine life that populated the recovering oceans, all of these trace their origins to the patient work of recovery that characterized the early Paleogen. Most importantly, the Paleogene recovery created the conditions that would eventually allow for the evolution of intelligence itself. The primates that appeared in the recovering forests, the complex ecosystems that provided environmental challenges and opportunities, the social behaviors that evolved in response to new ecological pressures. All of these were necessary prerequisites for the eventual evolution of human consciousness. The forests where early primates lived, the grasslands where our more recent ancestors evolved, the climate changes that drove human migration and cultural innovation, all of these trace their origins back to the Paleogen recovery. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Cretaceous was the world that made us possible. And so the story comes full circle. The catastrophe that ended the Age of Giants was also the beginning of the Age of Intelligence. The darkness that fell over the Earth 66 million years ago was followed by a dawn that would eventually illuminate not just the physical world, but the very nature of existence itself. The early primates that climbed through Paleogen forests were small, furry creatures that looked nothing like modern humans, but they carried within their genes the potential for everything that would follow. Their large brains, their grasping hands, their social behaviors, all were adaptations to life in the complex three-dimensional environment of the forest canopy. The evolution of primate intelligence was a gradual process that took tens of millions of years. Enhanced memory allowed early primates to remember the locations of food sources and safe sleeping sites. Problem-solving abilities helped them navigate the complex environment of the trees. Social intelligence enabled them to live in groups and coordinate their activities. These cognitive abilities were refined and enhanced over millions of years of evolution. The brains of primates grew larger and more complex. Their social behaviors became more sophisticated. Their tool-using abilities developed from simple manipulation of objects to the complex technologies that characterize human culture. The journey from the small, forest-dwelling primates of the Paleogene to modern humans was long and indirect. It involved numerous evolutionary innovations, environmental challenges, and adaptive radiations. But the foundation for that journey was laid during the recovery from the Great Extinction, when life was experimenting with new forms and new possibilities. In the end, the Paleogene recovery reminds us that every ending is also a beginning. Every catastrophe carries within it the seeds of renewal. Every extinction creates space for innovation. The Earth has always been a planet of change, and life has always found a way to adapt, to survive, to create something new and beautiful from the fragments of what came before. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, remember that you are part of this ancient story. The breath in your lungs, the blood in your veins, the thoughts in your mind, all are products of that long journey from the ashes of the Cretaceous to the complexity of the modern world. You carry within you the legacy of every creature that survived, every innovation that succeeded, every adaptation that allowed life to continue. The Earth is still turning, still changing, still creating new possibilities. The story that began with the first stirrings of life in ancient seas continues with every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of consciousness. We are not separate from this story. We are its latest chapter, its most recent experiment, its newest hope for the future. The same forces that rebuilt the world after the Great Dying are still at work today, still creating, still innovating, still reaching toward tomorrow. The dawn that followed the darkness 66 million years ago has never ended. It continues in every sunrise, every new life, every moment of wonder at the complexity and beauty of existence. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of something magnificent and eternal. The patient miracle of recovery that we've traced tonight continues in every cell of your body, every synapse in your brain, every beat of your heart. You are the latest product of that ancient renewal, the newest expression of life's endless creativity. Sweet dreams of ancient forests returning to barren ground, of small mammals venturing into a world of infinite possibility, of early birds taking flight in empty skies. Dream of the slow patience of evolution, the quiet persistence of life, the endless capacity for renewal that has carried this planet through every crisis and into every new dawn. The story continues, and you are part of it. Good night.